This was Andy Burnham's first day as Prime Minister.
I will soon go through that door behind me and issue my first instruction to end rough sleeping in our country.
Today he announced he wants to achieve a version of that by Christmas. How's he going to do it? We'll discuss on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Alex in the Westminster studio.
And we're going to start off talking about Andy Burnham's latest pledge on homelessness. So we're joined by Michael Buchanan, our social affairs correspondent. Hello, Michael.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Andy Burnham today announcing, basically building on his pledge that he did on his first day in Downing Street to eliminate rough sleeping. He's now talking about a real focused effort in England in the festive period, Michael.
He is. So his pledge is to get everyone in by Christmas. That's what he says. So basically to offer every rough sleeper in England some accommodation by Christmas. If you look at the official data, he's looking at somewhere in the region of about 4,800 people. Now, the first thing to say about the official data is that virtually everybody who knows anything about homelessness thinks of that as an undercount, because the way that they do that snapshot is really quite difficult to in some cases to count people. So that's the first challenge he's got. The second challenge
so actually hard to measure whether it's successful or not.
Well, but at least there'll be a baseline of 4,800 or so. And the second thing is, where is he going to find the accommodation, and particularly in this short space of time? But his pledge is this: he's going to spend £442 million tackling rough sleepers. He's going to work with mayors and local councils. They will be tasked with coming up with their own local solutions. They will be asked to find emergency accommodation in the first instance. So that might be bed and breakfast, hostels, night shelters, that kind of thing. And then longer term, they're hoping to source about just over 1,000 homes over 3 years to allow rough sleepers who are found temporary accommodation to move into more settled accommodation.
And there is a precedent for this, which was the early days of the COVID pandemic.
Well, this is where he thinks the inspiration can be helpful. It was called Everyone In. It started in 2020 in the pandemic, and it was really successful. But part of the reason it was successful wasn't just a focused government commitment to save rough sleepers from COVID-19. It was because the hotels were empty. So they could use the hotels to provide accommodation to rough sleepers in those circumstances. That is not going to be an option now. And as I say, the key challenge is, where are they going to find these housing units? Because even if you accept that there are 4,800 odd rough sleepers in England on any particular night, that is a lot of accommodation you're going to have to find.
Yeah, I remember doing Newscast in that period, and a really kind of magical episode when we were chatting to a guy that ran an empty hotel that was full of homeless people, and we met one of the homeless people who was living there, and just what a difference it made to her life for that period. And it was an amazing tale, but yeah, it was definitely temporary.
It was temporary, and that's the point on one level that he's making, is that if you look at that official data I said to you a minute ago, since 2021, which was the lowest point of rough sleeping in recent years, it's gone up. It's basically doubled. It's gone up by 96% since then. And fundamentally, the reasons for that haven't really changed. They are to do with people being entrenched rough sleepers. There's the cost of living pressures on top of that. The economy, the performance of the economy isn't as good as it should have been. There's psychiatric and mental health issues as well. So it's not simply, as one expert I was talking to today, it's not simply, even if you can find the accommodation, it's not as simple as just putting somebody in a house, because they need some wraparound support as well. And when he says about ending rough sleeping as well, I think, to be fair to him, that doesn't mean that you will never see a rough sleeper on the streets of England, even if he is successful. I remember in the pandemic, they managed to been in Edinburgh talking to a charity who had moved some rough sleepers into their the property that they had. And they were saying that for the first few nights, they'd go into their rooms, to clean up, the following morning, and the beds wouldn't have been used, because people had been so used to sleeping on a hard surface on the streets that they slept on the floor of the accommodation. So there's loads and loads and loads of work that you have to do in order to turn particularly an entrenched rough sleeper into somebody who's in settled accommodation.
And Alex, talking about precedent, this is something that Andy Burnham tried big time when he was Mayor of Greater Manchester.
Yeah, I mean, he's talked about it a lot, hasn't he? Because for him, this is clearly, and I think it's totally fair to say that it is a very personal ambition of his. When he was the Mayor of Greater Manchester, he made a very similar pledge, and he set up a scheme. So he created beds that were available in Greater Manchester so rough sleepers could go and use them. And initially there was some success around that. But in more recent years, the number of rough sleepers in Greater Manchester has crept up. So for the past 4 years, they've gone up consecutively every year, mirroring the kind of national trends that Michael was just talking about. But Andy Burnham's argument around that is because in Greater Manchester, they got a reputation for having this kind kind of accommodation available for rough sleepers, then it kind of encouraged rough sleepers from other areas to come to Greater Manchester and therefore put more pressure on the services. Now, his political opponents and his critics would say, actually, what happened is he just didn't deliver on what he said he was going to do and didn't give it enough attention or push, and he failed, in the words of the Conservatives. But clearly, this is something he's been committed to on a personal level for some time. And actually, if you remember, on the day that he took office in Downing Street, yes, he spoke about homelessness in his initial speech on the steps of Downing Street. But even before that, the first visit he made was to a charity that works with homeless people in London. So it's clearly something that he really believes in. And I think what the hope from Number 10 and Andy Burnham in particular is that if it gives this enough political welly and makes this a real political priority, as well as the funding and everything else, that it might give this the kind of push that it needs. But as Michael says, the ambition and the drive and the political will is one thing. The practicalities and the complexities around this issue are another one entirely.
And Faisal's going to pop into the studio at some point to talk about the economy, but he's got lots of experience of reporting in Manchester, so we'll get his take on what was going on there in the last few years. Michael, of course, rough sleeping, and we should be careful about our terminology here, rough sleeping is a very visible manifestation of homelessness, but there are lots of invisible manifestations of homelessness that are not this.
Completely. And as much as there is uncertainty about the data surrounding rough sleepers, what's absolutely clear is that there is a much, much bigger problem with homelessness in and of itself. The biggest category is something called temporary accommodation. And this is where families who can't find their own property go to their council, and the council provide them with accommodation somewhere. It's usually families, because having a child gives you access, means that the council has a legal duty to help you. And, the numbers of people in temporary accommodation in England are at record levels. The number of children is about just under 180,000, I think, from memory, living in temporary accommodation. The numbers have gone up for the last 18 consecutive quarters. So that is the big, big challenge when it comes to homelessness. But the most visible form of homelessness is obviously rough sleeping. But even though the numbers are smaller, the challenges are different, but no less intractable in some ways.
And Alex, with your local government hat on, how are local government reacting to this? Because if they're the ones that've got to deliver it, and presumably, OK, they're getting some extra money today, but they'll have to find the money to do it from their normal budgets.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Michael touched upon there is kind of the thing behind this and why this is such a complex problem. So councils already, with the cost of temporary accommodation, so that is people who don't have a permanent home of their own, so they're homeless in that respect. So the councils find them temporary accommodation, which can be things like B&Bs or other forms of short-term accommodation, which often just is not suitable for families or people with children or children themselves. The cost of providing that to councils, as well as the human cost of the people that are going through that system, has been growing and growing and growing, and has been putting real pressure on council budgets. Separately then, you've got this pot of money, this £442 million that Andy Burnham is going to give to local leaders to try and tackle the rough sleeping element of this. So first off, there's the problem with, as Michael said, what kind of accommodation they're going to find for those rough sleepers in the first instance. Can funding also be provided either through councils directly or by councils funding other charities or faith-based groups to provide the extra services and support that people might need with their often quite complex situations that they find themselves in when they end up rough sleeping? So that's the other bit of it. And then beyond all of that, there is the fact that over years, actually, when it comes to council budgets, a lot of the funding, and to be fair, council budgets have gone up recently, but for a long time, council budgets were cut. A lot of the funding that was put into services supporting vulnerable people was stripped away. So actually, some of those services themselves have kind of been, taken a bit of a hit, which makes it harder for that provision to be there. And then sitting behind all of that is the longer term problem about housing and housing supply. And we know that is another really big central thing that Andy Burnham wants to address. So with the big council house building programme, there's a lot of focus on social and affordable housing, but that is not going to be a quick fix either. So that's a kind of like broad brush of some of the challenges around this. But it is worth saying that the focus on this and this initial funding has undoubtedly been welcomed. People do want to see this issue addressed because it is often local leaders or charities or groups that work with vulnerable people who at the very front end of this just see the impact it has on individuals. So they are saying, and what you're hearing is, this is great, but to fix some of those really big, intractable problems that sit behind this, that's going to take a real long-term commitment and resource that goes with it as well.
This is something that's been tried before. So the Blair government in the late 90s, the early 2000s, they had a laser focus on reducing on rough sleeping back then. And when you speak to officials who worked on that programme, was something called the Rough Sleepers Unit back in those days. They really did.
Run by Louise Casey, Baroness
Run by
Casey.
Louise Casey, yeah, at that time. And they really did reduce rough sleeping quite significantly. And when you speak to people who were in that unit at that time, they say the absolute key to that, maybe not the key, but one of the keys to that was the fact that there was prime ministerial direction. So Tony Blair used to call in ministers, he'd call in officials into Downing Street and say, what are you doing? What are the blockages? Why aren't you doing it? So the fact that Andy Burnham appears from the outside at least to have that same level of commitment, there's a lot of hope amongst homeless charities that this will, if not, maybe not end rough sleeping, but bring the numbers down significantly. And to the point that Alex was saying, I mean, Andy Burnham today was visiting a homeless hostel in Newcastle, and he acknowledged that the money, as big as it is, £450 million, he acknowledged that government money in and of itself may not be enough. So he's going to have this summit in the autumn where he's going to bring together businesses and charities and organisations like that and see what they can do. And it's interesting that he was in Newcastle, because Newcastle had, if you like, a business-led approach to tackling rough sleeper for a number of years in the 2010s, and they were quite successful at doing it. And the man who led that effort took quite, if you like, a hard-nosed view.
And what does business-led mean?
Well, it meant that he tried to get a lot of businesses to work together and make it in their interest to try and get people off the streets, because he thought it was better for the city as a whole. And they were quite successful in doing that. And I think what Andy Burnham potentially is going to try and do with his conference in the autumn is to try and use some of that business know-how as well, that sometimes can get things done quicker than the public sector can, and just push through any types of barriers that maybe Whitehall thinks, oh, we can't do this that quickly.
Which is interesting, because that obviously was the approach that he very much championed in Greater Manchester as well. And I think just a really short aside, Adam, is I think it is fair to say that Andy Burnham, in the interviews he's given on this today, on Wednesday, he's been quite upfront about the fact that this is a sort of start, the funding, but it is about the political drive that he thinks is going to be the thing that pushes this through and forward.
And Michael, just going back to the Newcastle case, I always nearly say Newscastle whenever I say Newcastle. Sorry, people there. What was it businesses were actually doing? Well,
it was more the business approach to it all. So the man who led it was a successful local businessman, and he just looked at what was happening in the public sector and charities and all the rest of it, and he just thought that they had ways of working that could be shortcutted with that drive and that energy that often private sector companies have, and he just cut through some of the red tape and worked with organisations in a different way to get things to happen quicker. And I think often with the public sector, and certainly with housing and rough sleeping, there are loads and loads and loads of processes, and you have to go through this hoop and you have to go through that hoop, and we can only help you in these circumstances, and we're not here to help this type of person. And I think by taking an approach that says, look, we're just going to help you. We are going to help you. What do you need? Here's what we can offer you. I think that's one thing that may appeal to Mr. Burnham, because, as I said, he has put an incredibly tight deadline on this, an offer to everybody by Christmas. That's 4 months away. I know we're in the middle of a heat wave or at the end of a heat wave, but that is not a long time to try and find thousands of housing units for people.
So I'm standing in for Evan on PM on Radio 4 this afternoon, and I just pre-recorded the item about this, and we spoke to one of our colleagues who works in the BBC in Salford making documentaries. He's called Kevin, and he made a documentary a few years ago about this homeless guy he'd got to know really well in Manchester called Gary. And what was really striking for me was how Gary became homeless in the first place. So he had schizophrenia, he had a happy home life and a happy childhood, but as his condition made it harder for him to engage with his family and his job and his friends, he became more and more isolated, ended up bouncing from place to place to place where he was like sharing rooms and houses with people, couldn't handle that, ended up meeting a guy he says was from Eastern Europe, who then sort of almost pointed him out to where he could sleep in the city, what other homeless people to avoid, and who you could rely on, like which shop security guards wouldn't mind you bedding down in the doorway or sheltering in the doorway that night. Almost like a sort of social worker to become a rough sleeper. And that, for me, was just such an interesting pipeline to how this happens.
There is an absolute community on the street. where people look out for each other. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at Paddington Station in London, and loads of people were sleeping there, and they'd got to know each other. So when they needed to go to the toilet, they'd have a nod to somebody and say, "Can you look after my stuff?" Even though they didn't really know them. So there was that kind of community taking place. But having spoken to loads of rough sleepers over the years, the paths into it are extraordinary. We met somebody yesterday, used to be a warehouse worker, lost his job. There was one man we met in Milton Keynes, I think it was a few years ago. He was working as an analyst for Deloitte at the time, where he was rough sleeping at the same time. And he was just too proud to tell his friends that he couldn't afford his own housing. When we highlighted his story, I think he was inundated by people who knew him and were willing to support him. So the paths are extraordinary, but the community amongst them means that there is, for a number of them, not everybody, a lot of people feel frightened on the streets, but for a number of them, they feel there is that community and there's a safety in numbers because they recognise faces day after day.
And Faisal has joined us. Hello.
Hello.
Is it true you had a flat tyre on the way here?
I did, yeah.
And that's why you're about 4 minutes later than we were expecting. That's fine. That's the beauty of podcasting. Time is elastic. I hope it gets fixed.
Yeah. Well, I fixed it. This is why I'm here.
Good. I'm not sure I could do that. We're just talking about the Andy Burnham homelessness announcement. I mean, you've got a lot of experience of being in Manchester.
Yeah.
Anything that you can bring us from there?
Well, he made a big plea to eradicate rough sleeping. Then the difference, the technical difference is very important.
Yes, because we discussed that, don't worry.
The two concepts get elided. And he had some success at the beginning of his mayoralty. And some of those numbers coincided with national efforts around COVID. And then the numbers have crept back up again. They're still down on what he had inherited in Manchester, but he didn't eradicate it. I think that's the basic picture. And as you've been discussing with Michael, this phenomenon is both social and it's economic. So there is, if you like, I guess what COVID showed is that if you really, really wanted to, you could put in place a series of policies to stop this in extreme circumstances. I don't know what the bill for that was, but those policies are not permanent. They didn't prove to be permanent, and there are other determinants of this. But then there's the wider economic sort of lens on this, which is about the availability of housing, the cost of housing, its sort of responsiveness to local demand at different income levels. And then if you take Manchester itself, we've covered it before, we've done lots on the kind of growth of Manchester in the centre. Burnham in Greater Manchester made a big play of trying to return councils to building, and there were some financial arrangements that enabled that. Relatively modest numbers, but there were increases. But the repopulation of the centre of Manchester has been affected under the council by lots of lowering, actually, of the need
of the requirement to build social housing,
quote unquote, social and affordable housing. Now,
so those big skyscrapers you see in central Manchester, if they were being built somewhere else and they were following the rules, they would have built more social housing alongside them. So that exists in Manchester.
So, and this is a very interesting dilemma, because you're now seeing this transposed into a national sphere with some arguments about some of the planning rules. The basic track taken by, this is the City of Manchester officials, so this is almost pre-Burnham, was get the stuff built by any means necessary, and lower what they would have called, what the developers would have called red tape, allow them to pay for social housing in cheaper areas of the city, eliminate the need for it at all, and just sort of rub the sticks together of economics to get growth going, to generate a tax base, and then you can deal with the more fundamental problems of building of long-term homelessness. You generate an income stream. So that's very interesting, because now that argument, although I don't think Andy Burnham is widely seen to be a quiet success, but they don't talk about it that much. If you see that lowering of the standards in terms of getting housing built. Now, I think,
and I suppose that's the other end of the telescope of what we were talking about here about rough sleeping, even though it is one big telescope. Right, Michael, thank you very much for your analysis today. See you soon.
See you soon.
Right, Faisal, let's go fully into your wheelhouse now. We got the latest numbers for inflation. In other words, how much the price of things has gone up in the last year. And the magic number, although it's not magic for everyone, is?
2.9%.
Yeah.
so not a great number. Obviously, it's bumped up. Didn't quite
the target is 2.
The target is 2%. It went up from 2.6%. It was kind of widely expected, which doesn't mean it's not a thing. It was widely expected because you can predict these things a bit more closely, because what we know happened in July was that energy bills under the energy cap went up. And the last part of this kind of feeds straight through into the inflation number. So in a funny way, like the news value, this is interesting because like what we're doing is we're just collating together all of the news, but the central moving part here, we knew already, and we reported last month at the beginning of July. But some of the other moving parts in there are quite interesting. So food prices, the rate of inflation for food, it's a little bit counterintuitive. It's not what when we go out there and talk to people and vox pop people and go, they still feel food prices are very, very pricey.
Well, yeah, because I remember covering on this podcast the Food and Drink Federation saying food inflation is going to be 10% this year because of the knock-on effects on the Strait of Hormuz and fertilizer and agriculture and energy. Yeah. And actually, it's ended up being It's fallen. It's still rising, but we haven't had that shock. I think this is one of the big takeaways is quite rightly we pointed to the massive sort of seismic tectonic shift that occurred when the Strait of Hormuz closed for so much time. But actually, I think what we're seeing is some resilience in supply chains, more resilience than we would have expected. Now, that does not mean it isn't coming along the track, but it is worth noting, as you have noted, so far, that shock has been relatively muted outside of energy. And even in energy, given everything we've seen with the weather, and given the fact that summer is normally a low energy use time, this inflation will have bitten less than we would have thought. Yes.
So I think the story so far is perhaps half full rather than half empty, which is 2.9. You don't want that. Underlying inflation more muted than you would have expected, given the circumstances, and other forms of inflation settling better. Pause. Going into autumn, the energy price rise that we have seen, and one that is to come, is going to bite because we use more energy, and because it's continuing the squeeze up. But again, a piece of context. Not as much, not even a fraction as much as what we saw 4 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah, it's always worth looking at the graphs on the ONS website because you see that huge bulge in 2022 and there's a mini bulge now.
Yeah, and that's if everything stayed the same as we are now. Other things are going on in the world right now, though, and, what we're seeing in the markets generally, in the oil markets, and we'll get onto I'm sure the government debt markets, what we're seeing, I think, is the presumption, though, that however acute the crisis is from the Strait of Hormuz, that Donald Trump's self-interest would wrap all this up by around now, next few weeks, because of what's happening in the US elections. That assumption is being severely questioned by events. And you're seeing markets now thinking, oh, okay, this may now be a chronic situation, it may last. The thing I was really looking for is literally right now, next couple of weeks, is about Europe buying up gas in order to fill its storage levels.
Yeah,
that is what caused the mega spike 4 years ago, and so I'm just waiting to see what happens, and that is what would cause some concern about the winter.
Alex, just thinking about this in British political terms, it's reminding me of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. So they took what they call the policy costs, so the cost of government policies off people's energy bills to cut energy bills, but then world market fluctuations means that the price cap goes up, so people maybe don't notice the government doing the good thing for them. Similarly, Andy Burnham and John Healey say they will take the VAT off domestic electricity, but then actually the price cap goes up by more. So guess what? People don't necessarily notice the government doing a good thing for them.
Yeah, and doesn't it just show you how challenging it becomes and this tension that governments face when they choose to make such a priority of the cost of living? Now, you could argue it's not really a choice from a political perspective to put that right in front and centre of your agenda, because it is such a dominant issue for so many people right now who have been dealing with the cost of living for years now. Andy Burnham, exactly as you say, like Keir Starmer in the kind of latter period of his premiership, has chosen to really, really focus on the cost of living because they know just how much it affects people and how much people are looking to government to provide some sort of answer or solution. But the challenge is when you have got things that are happening globally that government in the UK has a very limited amount of control over, then whatever they do here might ultimately only have a really limited effect. And there's that question about how much credit they really get for it. Of course, we knew from Andy Burnham's first couple of announcements, so he talked, about cutting VAT on electricity bills, saving the average household about 45 quid a year. And then there was also that second announcement about the £2 bus fare cap. They weren't pretending at the time that that was an answer to the cost of living crisis for people. They were saying, look, this is a sort of down payment showing you our priorities and what we are hoping to focus on in government to make sure that you understand that we get it and we want to try and do some stuff to help you. But the thing that sits behind that is then, OK, so what levers might you have and can you pull both economically and politically to really make a difference in people's lives in the face of the global events that are pushing prices up?
Now, Faisal, you hinted at this a second ago, but there's been a sharp spike in the interest rates that governments pay for their borrowing on world markets, particularly in the US and the UK the last couple of days. Before we explain why that's happening, why do we all need to have a concern about this? Why do we care?
So these are the rates of interest effectively charged by markets to governments all around the world. And the thing we've focused on in particular, the movements have been super long-term loans, the equivalent of a mortgage, 30-year, 20-year, 30-year loans to governments. These are almost like the cash of the international financial system. They're traded in massive quantities and they normally move very, very smoothly. And actually, they are still moving smoothly, but they're actually, apart from
smoothly
today,
up.
but over the past few weeks, that has been smoothly up. And in effect, depending on which time period these loans are over, they can start to affect lending to households, mortgages, in terms of their cost, interest cost, to governments, of course, and therefore the room for manoeuvre they have over what they spend and what they tax and what they borrow, and to businesses too. Now, this is where the long-term loan part of this does matter. We've seen this movement mainly in these super long-term effective loans. That actually has more of an effect in a place like America than it does in the UK, because in America they have long-term mortgages. So for Donald Trump, he's looking at this, and what's also happening exactly the same time is the mortgage rate that's typically charged to a home buyer in America is creeping up to a psychologically important 7% market, precisely the wrong time for the Republicans. So there's some salience there. It tends to have more of an immediate sort of flow through to the UK economy when it's at the 2 and 5 years, because
that's what our mortgage rates.
Because our mortgage rates tend to be based on that. But it's already sort of tight situation, series of trade-offs and dilemmas for John Healey, the new Chancellor, going into the budget at the end of October, and this makes that worse. It's not. I see, and every time this happens, you get a whole people say, "Oh, look, we're going to have a Liz Truss moment again," or "Look, this is all about the UK." And quite plainly, this is global. Having said, and actually, the UK's very recent rise over the past sort of few weeks has been a little less than others, but that's because we had our spike a bit earlier.
Yeah.
So they're playing catch up.
Yeah.
So definitely noteworthy, consequential, global in nature, and with some interesting causes.
Well, one of which is AI and big AI companies in America.
This is a fascinating development because of the scale. And essentially, you imagine a chancellor with the red box outside number 11 and their equivalents all around the major economies. They have had a captive market of getting loans from the world banking system, from pension funds, from insurance companies. They've piled money into these safe assets, and relatively low interest rates have been charged for long-term government borrowing as a result. We're starting to see this go into reverse, and there's a variety of geopolitical reasons. But the newish factor is competing with, John Healey, as it will be with his red box asking to borrow money, will be all these AI companies who are raising the same sort of sums of money, hundreds of billions of dollars as it is. They're trying to borrow that money, not just in America, but in every country in the world. They're borrowing in pounds, they're borrowing in Swiss francs, in yen, in Australia, Australian dollars. They're going around the world trying to soak up the money, much of which would have gone straight into global government debt. As a result of that, that's having a knock-on impact on the interest rates paid by governments, which squeezes their ability to balance spending and taxation. It might mean that there may be some squeezes on government spending, welfare spending potentially, or there may have to be higher tax rises than otherwise. It may also put pressure on mortgage rates. But there's a new kid in town. There's competition for lending that is traditionally went straight into government coffers at lowish interest rates. And it is the AI companies, because they have huge needs to build the world's data centers for our AI future. This is not a consequence people really thought of in advance. It's not the only factor behind rising government interest rates around the world, but it's a pretty big one right now. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere, and it could be quite consequential for governments and for all of us.
And it affects people because every extra pound the government spends paying off its debts is one less pound to spend on the health service or defence or anything else the government wants to do. And because of the way the global financial system works, the cost of government debt can filter down to the cost of an individual person's mortgage.
Yes. Well, there's two tracks here. Balancing taxation and spending, it just means the cost of borrowing is higher, which potentially squeezes those other two things. It means maybe they'd have to raise taxes higher than otherwise or restrict spending. So slightly separately, it will also effectively raise interest rates for businesses and for households via mortgages. Probably more in America than in the UK, but there'll be a UK factor too. So we're seeing in the mortgage market that people had hoped and presumed that mortgage rates would start to come down quite considerably this year, and they've bounced around. We thought that most of the action driving all of this stuff would be because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, and that's still a massive factor, perhaps the biggest factor. But now you have this additional leg of the AI companies competing with governments. It's like a giant power play. And they're competing with our governments directly for pools of cash that are readily lent in the tens and hundreds of billions.
But Alex, isn't it interesting that as journalists covering politics, we have these paradigm shifts? It's like, if I could be so pretentious. It's your arrival in the studio, Faisal, has got me reaching for my thesaurus. I'm not accusing you of pretentious.
Don't worry.
But you are suggesting that you definitely don't need a thesaurus when I'm in the studio, which I love.
No, paradigm shift. So that when we actually have to start thinking in a slightly different way. And the idea of looking at John Healey's budget at the end of October, Alex, and having to factor in the fact that John Healey is having to compete with big American tech companies to get people to lend to him to fund the government is a new thing for us to have to sort of add to our thought process.
Yeah, that's a totally new thing. And that's before you even get to the questions about these consequences of this huge, massive kind of shift in terms of the tech companies and AI with the practicalities around data centers like water and, like grid connections and all the rest. I mean, I think it's one of those things where we've all been talking about AI and the consequence of it for good or for ill for a really long time, right? And I think for most people that comes through about the day-to-day use of AI, the safety of AI, the kind of impact it might have on human autonomy, on jobs, on markets, that kind of thing. But the other consequence of this, of course, is the way that it might affect the choices that the Chancellor makes come October. And that's really quite an extraordinary place to be in. And I think what is also worth remembering at this point is that since Andy Burnham and John Healey came in as Prime Minister and Chancellor, John Healey was clearly in government before as Defence Secretary, but, now he's in this new gig as Chancellor. We haven't had Westminster in sitting. It's been the summer recess. And so what they've been able to do with the announcements that they've made is be very deliberate and try and control the narrative and focus on the things that they want to focus on as this sort of new administration. And a lot of that has been around the announcements they've made so far on the cost of living, with a very clear promise of more to come. And the budget in October, the end of October, because we now know the date of it, is just going to be a really, really big early test, a really significant one, giving all of those different competing things that the Chancellor's going to have to weigh up and the need to try to put it in the simplest terms, as we so often say, to make a difference that people can really feel.
So, Adam, I think, just reflecting on what Alex just said there, that we're already seeing the impact of this pressure. Because if you take a step back and you look at the series of gridded announcements we've had from this new administration and you add them all up, they are relatively modest.
And a lot of it is money that they just found from unspent pots of other money.
All that sort of stuff. They're really scratching around. But I don't know, from a political perspective, they're getting value out of the sense that they want to project, which is we're trying to help. We're trying to help. and maybe there's going to be some more in the future. But they aren't actually spending huge sums. And let me give you a piece of context for that. If you go back 4 years, Liz Truss government, precisely what we were talking about in terms of bills, they spent, in advance, we thought it was going to cost £80 billion, the energy price guarantee that kept bills down. It ended up costing, depending on which measure you do, 20, 30, 40 billion. So huge amounts. And mainly people did not notice it, right? People did not notice it. So you imagine the sort of value of help.
Whereas
of the perception of help placed.
Where if you spend an extra 100 million and there are no more rough sleepers in your neighbourhood, you do notice that.
Well, there may be that, and bus fares as well. Occasionally you see around Westminster a bit of sniffiness about bus fares. Massively important issue. Billions of bus journeys made in the UK. So, I don't know if this is the case, but, do they have some sort of spreadsheet, which is the sort of efficiency of spending a pound of exchequer money
people notice,
on versus the how noticed it is. Certainly the bus fare initiative, for example, would hugely outrank how much money they had to spend merely. They still went up energy bills back in 2022 to record levels, but they would have gone up to even double that, right? And they didn't. But people didn't notice that difference. So I think you're seeing some of that, and I think to reflect back into the markets, and we're expecting a big speech from the Chancellor at some point in the next few weeks with a 10-year plan. And I do detect, if you like, a strategy with one eye on the markets, which is not just about austerity and we can look after the numbers and count the pennies, but also that we have a series of strategies. For example, when we're doing cost of living help, it is quite efficient.
Yes.
We may be doing something with oil to help with tax revenue there, and then with the 10-year plan, we're going to try and refocus spending on investment, which yields growth in tax revenue.
I'm also just thinking back to when you said the AI companies are like another country on the global debt markets. You could call them the USAI, the United States of Artificial Intelligence. I'm sure that will not catch on in the FT. That's my dream, to have an acronym coined in the FT. Right. Faisal, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alex, thanks to you too.
Pleasure.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. A reminder that we're available as a podcast every single day of the week, and you can find us on BBC Sounds. And we'll be back with another newscast very soon. Bye-bye.